Tonight, we begin among ruins that were never meant to become ruins. Long before maps were drawn the way we know them now, and long before history was written as a sequence of dates and empires, people were already trying to decide which creations of the human world deserved to be remembered, not reminded for a season or for a generation, but reminded for as long as memory itself could travel. Somewhere in the ancient Mediterranean, travelers began to write lists of remarkable places. They described temples that glittered under torchlight, statues so tall they seemed to breathe with the horizon, gardens that rose like green mountains from dry earth, and towers that carried fire into the night sky so sailors would never lose their way. These travelers did not know they were inventing something new. They believed they were simply recording what they had seen. Yet in doing so, they quietly created one of the earliest attempts to answer a question that still follows us today. What does humanity build when it wants to be remembered forever? The answer became known as the 7 Wonders of the Ancient World. It was not a scientific list. It was incomplete. It wasn't even fair. Most of the monuments stood within reach of the same sea routes the writers already knew. Entire civilizations beyond their horizon remain invisible to them. And yet the list endures, not because it was perfect, but because it captured something older than accuracy. It captured longing. Each wonder was a signal sent forward through time, a structure large enough, bright enough, or mysterious enough that someone in the distant future might stop, look up, and ask who had built it and why. Some of those wonders disappeared in fire. Some fell to earthquakes. Some were dismantled stone by stone and carried away into new cities. One may never have existed at all. And yet their absence never made them disappear. Because once a monument enters memory, it begins a second life that stone alone cannot hold. Tonight, we will walk slowly through that second life. We will begin beside pyramids that were raised from desert light, pass through lantern-lit streets where beauty exists only for an evening, step into courts where a single movement of a rubber ball was believed to keep the sun alive, and finally, follow the path of a queen whose story became stronger than the empire she defeated. Across these places and centuries, a quiet pattern begins to appear. Human beings build not because they can defeat time, but because they hope to speak across it. Even the most enduring structures do not remain unchanged. Marble cracks, bronze melts, timber burns, entire cities sink beneath sand or water. Yet something continues moving forward long after the stone is gone. Stories travel where monuments cannot. Sometimes they travel in poems, sometimes in rituals, sometimes in the memory of a single name carried across generations of wind and grass, and sometimes they travel in silence. If you stand today beside the Great Pyramid at Giza, you are standing beside the only one of the ancient wonders that still rises where it was first built. It no longer shines with polished white stone the way it once did. The desert has softened its edges. The centuries have carried away its outer skin. And yet it still stands with the same quiet certainty it held when it first appeared on the horizon more than 4,000 years ago. It is easy to think of it as a survivor, but it is also something else. It is a reminder that survival is never the whole story. Because the other wonders did not vanish when their walls collapsed, they simply moved into another form. They became questions. They became legends. They became fragments of conversations that people have continued for thousands of years without realizing where those conversations began. In this way, the ancient wonders never truly disappeared. They changed shape. And perhaps that is what all human creations eventually do. They leave the world of stone and enter the world of memory, where they grow quieter, softer, and sometimes even more powerful than they were before. So tonight, as the light fades gently across deserts and harbors and forgotten cities, we begin not by asking how the wonders were built. We begin by asking why anyone believed they could last forever at all. Long before guidebooks, long before museums, and long before history became something people studied in schools, there were travelers who moved slowly across the ancient Mediterranean world with only curiosity to guide them. They sailed along coastlines where unfamiliar cities rose from the horizon like pale shapes in morning mist. They stepped onto stone harbors where languages sounded different from their own. They followed dusty roads that led inland toward temples, statues, and towers whose size seemed almost impossible to explain once they returned home. These travelers did not think of themselves as historians. They were observers, list makers, story collectors. They wrote down what surprised them most, not because they believed they were preserving the past, but because they wanted to describe the feeling of standing in front of something extraordinary. Somewhere during the centuries before the Common Era, a small group of these observers began to do something unusual. Instead of simply describing what they had seen, they began choosing which places deserved to be remembered above all others. They made a list. It was not a long list. It did not include every remarkable building in the world. It did not even include every remarkable building they themselves had seen. It included only seven places that seemed large enough, beautiful enough, or mysterious enough to represent the greatest achievements of human hands. The number itself was not accidental. In the ancient Mediterranean imagination, 7 was often associated with completeness. There were 7 visible wandering lights in the night sky that people later called planets. There were 7 strings on certain musical instruments. 7 became a number that suggested balance, harmony, and a sense that nothing essential had been left out. So when these travelers chose 7 wonders, they were not simply counting buildings. They were creating a picture of what greatness looked like. Most of the places they selected stood within reach of the sea routes they already knew. This meant the list reflected their journeys as much as it reflected the world itself. Far beyond their horizon, other civilizations were raising walls that stretched across mountains and building cities that would have astonished them. Yet those places remained absent from the list, not because they lacked importance, but because they lay beyond the traveler's experience. In this way, the 7 wonders became something more personal than they first appeared. They were not a map of the world, they were a map of attention. Each wonder represents a place where someone had stood still, looked upward, and felt that human ambition had reached its highest point. There was a pyramid rising from desert sand beside the Nile River. There were gardens said to hang in the air above Babylon. There was a statue of the god Zeus seated in quiet authority within a temple at Olympia. There stood a vast temple dedicated to Artemis, shining with marble columns in the city of Ephesus. There was a royal tomb at Halicarnassus built so carefully that even death seemed to become architecture. There rose a bronze figure of the sun god beside the harbor of Rhodes, and there stood a lighthouse at Alexandria whose flame guided ships through darkness long before the invention of any modern navigation. These were not ordinary buildings. They were landmarks of imagination. To see one of them was to feel that human beings were capable of shaping the world on a scale that approached the work of gods. Yet something else was happening quietly beneath the surface of this list. The travelers who wrote these descriptions may not have realized it, but they were doing more than recording what existed in their own time. They were deciding what the future would remember. Once a monument enters a list like this, it begins to change. It is no longer simply a structure made of stone or bronze or timber. It becomes a symbol. It becomes a story. It becomes something that people talk about even after they have never seen it with their own eyes. In this way, the 7 wonders were never only about architecture. They were about memory. They were attempts to choose which pieces of the present should survive inside the imagination of the future. And perhaps without intending to, those travelers created something even more powerful than the monuments themselves. They created a tradition of looking backward across centuries and asking what still remains. Today, when people speak of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, they are repeating a conversation that began more than 2,000 years ago beside harbors, along caravan roads and in quiet rooms where travelers unrolled their scrolls and tried to describe what they had seen. Most of the monuments on their list will eventually fall. Storms will shake them, fires will consume them, armies will dismantle them stone by stone. Time will soften their edges until only fragments remain. But the list itself survived. And among the 7 names they preserved, one structure would outlast all the others, rising patiently through centuries of wind and sunlight, as if it had been waiting for history to catch up with it. Among all the monuments the ancient travelers chose to remember, one stood older than the rest even in their own time. By the time Greek visitors first sailed up the Nile River and saw it rising from the desert horizon, the Great Pyramid was already more than 2,000 years old. It had watched kingdoms rise and fall before their language had even taken its familiar shape. It had already outlived the memory of the people who first carried its stones. Even then, it must have seemed less like a building and more like part of the landscape itself. The pyramid was built for a ruler known today as Khufu, a king who lived in Egypt more than 4,000 years ago. He did not leave behind a long written story about his life. He did not leave behind a palace filled with inscriptions describing his victories. Instead, he left behind something quieter and far more difficult to ignore. He left a mountain made by human hands. When the pyramid was first completed, it did not look the way it does now. Today, its surface appears rough and stepped, the golden color of desert stone blending gently into the surrounding sand. But in its original form, the pyramid was covered with smooth outer casing stones made of bright white limestone. These stones were cut so precisely that sunlight reflected from them like water. Travelers approaching from miles away would have seen the monument shining across the horizon long before they reached the plateau where it stood. In that light, the pyramid must have seemed less like architecture and more like intention made visible. It rose to a height of nearly 500 feet, which is roughly the height of a modern building with more than 40 floors. It was assembled from millions of individual blocks of limestone, each one heavy enough that moving it required patience, coordination, and extraordinary effort. For generations, people wondered whether such a structure could only have been built by enslaved workers forced into labor. But evidence discovered near the pyramid tells a different story. Archaeologists found remains of bakeries, breweries, sleeping quarters, and small medical spaces close to the construction site. These discoveries suggest that many of the people who worked on the pyramid were not slaves, but organized laborers supported by the state. They lived in temporary settlements beside the monument as it slowly rose upward, season after season, stone after stone. Their work stretched across decades. Some of them will have spent most of their adult lives shaping and moving blocks that will eventually become corridors no visitors will see and chambers no sunlight will reach. Yet even without seeing the finished structure, they participate in something they understand as larger than themselves. They were helping a king speak to the future. Inside the pyramid, narrow passageways lead toward a chamber where Khufu's stone coffin still rests. The chamber was not placed inside the structure after construction was completed. It was positioned there before the upper layers were finished, meaning the builders raised the pyramid around it. The monument was never meant to open again once it was sealed. It was designed as a destination that could not be returned from. Yet the pyramid was not only about burial. Their sides were aligned with remarkable care so that they faced the four directions of the horizon. The northern face pointed toward the sky that never seemed to move, where certain stars circled without setting below the earth. To the ancient Egyptians, that region of the sky represented permanence. It was the part of the heavens where things did not disappear. In this way, the pyramid became more than a tomb. It became a bridge between earth and eternity. Centuries passed, empires changed. The smooth outer casing stones were gradually loosened by earthquakes and later carried away to build parts of the nearby city that would become Cairo. Wind reshaped the desert around its base. Travelers came and left. Each generation brings new explanations for how it might have been built. Some imagined lost technologies, others imagined visitors from distant worlds. Yet the simple explanation remains the most powerful. It was built by people. People who measured distances with rope and shadow. People who studied the movement of stars without telescopes. People who lift stone with patience instead of machines. People who believed that memory could be built if enough hands worked together long enough. And somehow, they were right. The pyramid did not survive because it was the most beautiful of the wonders. It did not survive because it was protected from change. It survived because it stood where rain rarely falls, where wood cannot rot easily, and where moving millions of tons of stone was more difficult than leaving them where they were. It survived because time passed more slowly there. Today, visitors still stand at its base and look upward with the same question that must have followed the first travelers who wrote its name into their lists. How did they build something like this? But there's another question that lingers just as quietly aside it. Why did they believe it needed to last forever? While the pyramid answered that question with stone, another wonder would answer it with a story so beautiful that people continued repeating it long after they began to wonder whether it had ever stood anywhere at all. Not all wonders remain behind in stone. Some survive in a quieter way, carried forward by description rather than evidence, by memory rather than ruins. Among the 7 wonders of the ancient world, none has left a deeper trace of uncertainty than the Hanging Gardens. Ancient writers described them as rising above the dry plains of Mesopotamia like a green mountain shaped by human hands. They imagined terraces stacked one above another, each level filled with trees, flowers, and running water. Vines were said to spill gently over stone edges. A shade gathered beneath their branches. Cool air moved across their walkways while the surrounding land remained warm and dusty beneath the sun. To travelers approaching the city of Babylon, the gardens must have seemed almost impossible, a forest growing in the sky. According to tradition, they were built by King Nebuchadnezzar II, nearly 600 years before the Common Era. The story says that his queen, Amidis, had grown up in a distant land of hills and forests far to the north. When she arrived in Babylon, she found herself surrounded instead by wide plains and flat horizons that stretched endlessly toward the desert. Wanting to ease her homesickness, the king ordered the construction of terraces high enough to resemble the landscapes she had left behind. If the story is true, then the gardens were not only an achievement of engineering, they were an act of remembrance. Creating such a place would not have been simple. Water does not naturally climb upward. To keep trees alive on elevated terraces, builders would have needed to lift water from the nearby river again and again, raising it through hidden channels from one level to the next. Ancient descriptions speak of mechanical systems that carry water upward in a steady rhythm, allowing roots to remain moist even under the heat of the Mesopotamian sun. It must have seemed miraculous to those who saw it, a mountain that drank from a river. Yet, something unusual begins to happen when modern historians search for traces of this wonder. Excavations in Babylon uncovered palaces, walls, gates, and temples, but no remains clearly connected to the Hanging Gardens. No terraces, no irrigation channels, no large foundations enough to support the layered landscape described in ancient texts. The absence is striking. For centuries, archaeologists walked through the ruins of Babylon expecting to find the gardens waiting quietly beneath the soil. Instead, they found silence. This silence led some scholars to consider another possibility. Perhaps the gardens were never in Babylon at all. Far to the north, in the Assyrian city of Nineveh, inscriptions describe a royal complex filled with elevated gardens and advanced irrigation systems that carry water across long distances. These texts speak of channels carved through stone, aqueducts that crossed valleys, and machines designed to raise water toward terraces built beside a palace. The descriptions sound remarkable, similar to the wonder later attributed to Babylon. It is possible that ancient travelers heard stories about these gardens but misunderstood where they stood. Over time, the story may have shifted from one city to another, settling in Babylon because its name carries greater familiarity in the imagination of Greek writers. If this is true, then the Hanging Gardens were not lost. They were misplaced. There is also another possibility, quieter and perhaps even more intriguing. It is possible that the gardens never existed in quite the way they were described. Ancient writers sometimes shaped their stories with imagination as much as observation. A traveler hears about distant terraces filled with trees, might describe them as larger than they truly were. Or another might repeat the story with additional details. Over generations, these descriptions could grow more vivid until they formed a picture more beautiful than the original landscape itself. In this way, the Hanging Gardens may have become a wonder not because of what they were, but because of what people hoped they had been. Even today, the idea of a forest rising above the desert continues to feel strangely convincing. It speaks to something familiar in human experience. Whenever people leave their homes behind and travel into unfamiliar lands, they carry memories of rivers, hills, and trees with them. The story of a king building a garden to restore those memories feels less like architecture and more like kindness. Perhaps that is why the gardens endured even after their location faded. They answered a quiet longing. And so the hanging gardens remain suspended between history and imagination, neither fully present nor fully absent. They exist in the same way many ancient stories exist, balanced between what can be proven and what continues to be remembered because it feels true. Among the wonders of the ancient world, they are the only one that might never have cast a shadow on the ground. Yet their image still rises easily in the mind. And while some wonders disappear because of earthquakes or time, another would vanish for a very different reason, leaving behind a lesson about how destruction itself can become a path to immortality. In the ancient city of Ephesus, not far from the western edge of what is now modern Turkey, there once stood a temple so large and luminous that travelers approached it from a distance, believed they were seeing something closer to a palace of the sky than a structure of stone. It was dedicated to Artemis, a goddess associated with forests, animals, and the quiet independence of the natural world. Yet the built temple in her honor did not hide among trees or hills. It rose instead of open ground, supported by rows of marble columns that seemed to extend endlessly in every direction. There were more than 100 columns in all, each rising to a height taller than most houses of the ancient world. Their surfaces reflect torchlight at night and sunlight by day, so that the temple appears to change color as the hours passed. At dawn, it carried a faint pink glow. At midday, it shone white and bright beneath the open sky. But by evening, it seemed almost silver as shadows lengthened across the plain. People traveled great distances to see it. Some came to pray, some came to trade. Others came simply because they had heard that somewhere in Ephesus there stood a building unlike any other on earth. Temples in the ancient world were not only places of worship, they were also places of gathering, protection, and memory. Within their walls, offerings were stored, agreements were made, and stories were repeated from one generation to the next. To stand inside such a space was to feel connected not only to a god, but to a community that stretched backward into the past and forward into the future. The Temple of Artemis was one of the largest expressions of that connection ever built. Yet its story will become famous not only because of its beauty, but because of the night it disappeared in flame. In the middle of the 4th century before the Common Era, a man later known as Herostratus entered the temple under cover of darkness. He carried with him neither treasure nor weapon intended for battle. Instead, he carried fire. His reason was simple, though difficult to understand. He wanted to be remembered. Ancient writers tell us that he believed if he destroyed something magnificent enough, his name would survive alongside it. He did not expect admiration, he expected attention. And in a world where monuments were built to preserve memory, he chose to create memory through ruin instead. The warehouse was burned, columns cracked in the heat, roof beams collapsed inward, offerings gathered over generations disappeared in smoke. By morning, one of the greatest structures of the ancient world had become a field of blackened stone. The people of Ephesus responded quickly. They rebuilt the temple, restored its columns, and expanded its size so that it became even more impressive than before. But they also tried something else. They attempted to erase the name of the man who had destroyed it. According to later accounts, speaking his name was forbidden. Records of his identity were meant to disappear so that he would not receive the immortality he had hoped for. Yet the attempt failed in a quiet and familiar way. Writers continued repeating the story, and through repetition, the name survived. It survived not because people admired what he had done, but because they couldn't stop telling the story of why it happened. In this way, destruction achieved what creation alone could not. It secured memory. The rebuilt temple stood for centuries after the fire. Pilgrims returned, trade resumed. The columns rose again in ordered rows across the plain. For a time, it seemed as though the night of flames had been only a brief interruption in a much longer story. But history rarely allows monuments to remain unchanged forever. Centuries later, during a period of migration and conflict across the eastern Mediterranean, groups known to later writers as the Goths entered the region and attacked the city. The temple suffered again. Its treasures were carried away, its structure weakened. Over time, as new religious traditions spread through the empire, the temple lost its central place in public life. Marble that once supported its roof was removed and carried elsewhere. Some stones became part of churches, others were used in fortifications. Slowly, almost quietly, the temple disappeared not through a single dramatic moment, but through many small acts of reuse. Today, only fragments remain where the columns once stood. A single reconstructed pillar rises above the wet ground where the temple once stretched across open space. Around it, reeds grow where pilgrims once gathered, birds move through the air where incense once drifted upward. And yet the temple of Artemis is not forgotten. Its story survives in descriptions written by travelers who never expected their words to become more permanent than the stone they described. It survives in the memory of a night when fire changed the fate of a monument. And it survives in the strange reminder that sometimes the desire to be remembered can reshape history in ways no architect could ever plan. Why, even so, the temple was not the only wonder shaped by devotion to the divine. Elsewhere in Greece, another monument once stood inside a sacred space, not beneath open sky, but within a quiet hall where a seated figure of gold and ivory looked outward across centuries that would not allow it to remain. In the Valley of Olympia, where olive trees once cast long shadows across the ground and athletes gathered every 4 years to compete in honor of the gods, there stood a temple whose quiet interior held one of the most extraordinary creations of the ancient world. Inside that temple sat Zeus, not as a distant figure in the sky and not as a name spoken in prayer, but as a presence shaped in gold and ivory, towering above the visitors who enter the chamber beneath his gaze. The statue was created by a sculptor named Phidias, whose work was already admired throughout Greece for its balance and calm authority. When he was asked to design an image of Zeus for Olympia, he did not carve a standing warrior or a ruler in motion. Instead, he imagined the king of the gods seated. It was a simple choice, but a powerful one. The seated figure filled nearly the entire height of the temple's inner room. Visitors who stepped inside did not look across at Zeus. They looked upward. His head rose close to the ceiling. His shoulders stretched wide across the space. The throne on which he sat was decorated with carved figures and small scenes from mythology, each one carefully placed so that the entire structure seemed less like furniture and more like a miniature world beneath his authority. The body of the statue was shaped from ivory, polished until it resembled living skin. Over this surface were placed sheets of gold that formed his robe, his sandals, and the ornaments that rested around him. In one hand, he held a small figure representing victory. In the other, he carried a staff that signified power not only over the earth, but over the heavens themselves. The combination of ivory and gold creates a strange effect in the dim interior light of the temple. The statue did not shine in the bright way marble does under sunlight. Instead, it seemed to glow softly, as though it carried its own quiet source of illumination. Oil lamps placed around the chamber reflected gently from its surfaces. Shadows moved slowly across the throne and along the folds of the robe as the flames flickered. Visitors often described the experience not simply as seeing a statue, but as standing in the presence of something alive. Some said they felt smaller in the room than they expected. Others said they left with the impression that the god had been watching them as closely as they had been watching him. For nearly 800 years, the statue remained in that temple. Generations traveled to Olympia to see it. Pilgrims arrived from distant cities. Athletes competing in the great games passed through its doorway before entering the stadium nearby. It became one of the most recognizable images of divine authority in the ancient Greek world. Yet, like many wonders, it did not remain where it was first placed. As centuries passed and political power shifted across the Mediterranean, the statue was eventually transported far from Olympia to the city later known as Constantinople. There, it was installed inside a palace where it could be admired in a new setting, among halls and courtyards very different from the olive groves of its original home. The journey itself must have been extraordinary. Moving such a structure requires careful planning, patience, and trust that its delicate materials will survive the distance. Ivory can crack, gold can bend. Yet for a time, the statue endured this change of place just as it had endured the passing of centuries. It stood again in a new hall, watched by new visitors, carrying with it the memory of another landscape far away. But its second life will not last as long as its first. At some point during the centuries that followed its arrival, a fire spread through the building where it stood. Flames moved along wooden beams. Smoke fills the air. Heat gathered in the chamber where the statue had once appeared so calm and permanent. Ivory darkens under heat. Gold softens. Structures carefully assembled over generations can vanish in a single night. When the fire ended, the statue of Zeus was gone. Nothing remains except descriptions written by those who had seen it before the flames. No fragments of the throne, no pieces of the robe, no trace of the face that had once looked outward from the shadows of the temple at Olympia. Yet, even without its material form, the statue did not disappear completely. Artists continued to imagine what it must have looked like. Writers repeat the stories of visitors who had stood beneath its height. Coins and small carvings preserve hints of its shape. Over time, the memory of the statue became more widely known than the object itself had ever been. In this way, Zeus continued to sit within the imagination long after his throne had burned. The wonder survives without its substance. And while this seated god disappeared slowly through relocation and accident, another wonder would rise from grief rather than devotion, built not for a deity, but for a ruler whose memory would become so closely tied to architecture that his name would eventually change the language people used to describe monuments of the dead. On the southwest coast of Anatolia, where the land slopes gently toward a wide blue harbor and the air carries the quiet sound of waves against stone, there once stood a monument built not for a god and not for a victory, but for a memory that one woman refused to let disappear. Its name came from a ruler called Mausolus. During his lifetime, Mausolus governed a region known as Caria, a place where Greek and Persian traditions met and blended in ways that shaped both politics and culture. He ruled from the city of Halicarnassus, a coastal settlement that faced the open sea and welcomed travelers from many directions. Like many rulers of the ancient world, he strengthened his city with walls and temples, but he did not live long enough to see the most extraordinary structure associated with his name. That structure would be built after his death. It was his wife, Artemisia II, who began the project. Ancient writers describe her grief as deep and lasting. Instead of expressing her loss through ceremony alone, she chose to transform it into architecture. She ordered the construction of a tomb unlike any the region had seen before, a structure so carefully designed and richly decorated that it would preserve not only the memory of Mausolus himself, but the feeling of devotion that inspired its creation. The monument rose slowly above the city. From a distance, travelers approaching the harbor would first see its upper platform catching the sunlight. As they came closer, they will begin to notice the carved figures arranged along its sides. These sculptures showed battles, processes, animals, and gods moving across stone surfaces with a sense of motion that seemed almost alive. The artists who created them were among the most respected sculptors of their time, each contributing panels that together formed a continuous story wrapping around the structure. Above these carvings stand a row of columns supporting a stepped roof, and at the very top, visible from across the water, there rose a statue of Mausolus and Artemisia together in a chariot, moving forward as though their journey continued beyond the limits of the tomb itself. It was not just a burial place. It was a statement that memory could travel further than death. The structure stands for centuries. Empires shifts around it, languages changed, trade routes moved. Yet the tomb remains visible beside the harbor, its sculptures weathering slowly under sun and wind. Travelers continued to visit it long after the people who had first built it were gone. Over time, its name became something more than a personal memorial. It became a word. Eventually, the name mausolus began to be used to describe grand tombs in general. The structure at Halicarnassus was so distinctive that it reshaped the language people used to talk about remembrance itself. Even today, when people refer to a mausoleum, they are repeating the memory of this monument without always realizing where the word began. In this way, the tomb achieved something few buildings ever do. It entered speech as well as history. Yet even structures built from grief cannot escape the slow patience of the earth. Centuries after its completion, earthquakes began to shake the region. The ground beneath Halicarnassus shifted again and again, loosening stones that had once been placed with careful precision. Columns tilted, sculptures fell, walls cracked. What had stood firm beside the harbor for generations gradually became a field of broken marble. Later, visitors walking through the ruins found fragments scattered across the site where the monument had once risen in complete form. Some pieces were carried away by local builders who saw in the fallen stones an opportunity to create something new. Others remain where they had fallen, half buried beneath soil and grass. During the medieval period, knights constructing a fortress nearby reused many of these blocks, installing them into new walls that still stand today. In this way, the tomb did not vanish entirely. It changed shape. Stone that had once carried carved stories of kings and gods became part of towers and defenses facing the sea, while sculptures that had once decorated a royal monument were set into structures designed for protection rather than remembrance. And yet the mausoleum at Halicarnassus did not disappear with its stones. Its name remained, its story remained, its purpose remains clear even after its form was gone. It had been built so that one life would not fade unnoticed into the past. And in a quiet way, it succeeded beyond anything its builders could have imagined. The monument survived not only in fragments of marble, but in the language people continued to use whenever they tried to preserve the memory of someone they did not wish to forget. Still, not all wonders were shaped by grief or devotion. Some were built to celebrate victory itself, like rising beside the sea as symbols of triumph so large that ships approaching the harbor could see them long before they reached the shore. Yet even those monuments would learn how quickly the earth can remind human ambition of its limits. On the island of Rhodes, where the sunlight spreads wide across the surface of the sea and ships once arrived from every direction of the Mediterranean world, the people of the city decided to remember a moment when they had nearly lost everything. The threat had come from a powerful army that attempted to take the island by force. For months, the city endured the pressure of siege. Towers were raised outside its walls, weapons were prepared, supplies were guarded carefully. Yet the defenders held their ground, and in time the attackers withdrew, leaving behind not only their abandoned equipment, but the memory of a victory that seemed larger than the island itself. The people of Rhodes did not respond with silence. They chose to build something. Using bronze gathered from weapons left behind by the defeated army, they began constructing a statue dedicated to Helios, the sun god they believed watched over their island. The statue would stand near the harbor where ships entered the city, not hidden behind walls or enclosed within a temple, but placed where the open sky could surround it on all sides. It was intended to be seen from far away. The sculptor responsible for the project was a man named Chares of Lindos. He imagined Helios not seated and not sheltered, but standing upright in full view of sea and horizon. The figure rose gradually above the shoreline as workers assembled its structure piece by piece. Bronze plates were carefully shaped and fixed around an internal framework that gave the statue both height and balance. Over the course of many years, the figure continued to grow. When it was finally completed, the statue stood taller than most buildings in the ancient world. From the decks of approaching ships, travelers could see the shining surface of bronze catching the sunlight long before they reached the harbor itself. The figure did not stand across the entrance to the harbor as later stories sometimes suggested. Instead, it stood beside it, watching the movement of ships as they arrived and departed. Even so, its presence must have felt enormous. To sailors who had crossed wide stretches of open water, The sight of Helios rising above the shore would have signaled safety, arrival, and the promise of rest after long travel. To the people of Rhodes, it represents something deeper. It was a reminder that their city had survived when it might easily have fallen. Victory had taken shape in metal. Yet the Colossus will not remain standing for long. Only a few decades after its completion, the ground beneath Rhodes began to move. An earthquake passed through the island, shaking buildings and breaking walls. The statue of Helios could not withstand the shifting earth. Its knees gave way, and the enormous figure collapsed onto the ground beside the harbor it had once watched over. The fall must have been sudden. Bronze that had reflected sunlight across the sea now lay scattered across the earth. Sections of the statue rested where they had fallen, too large and too heavy to be moved easily. Visitors arriving in Rhodes during the centuries that followed described the remains with a mixture of wonder and curiosity. Even lying on the ground, the fragments of the statue were impressive. One writer remarked that a single finger of the fallen figure was larger than most human bodies. For generations, the people of Rhodes chose not to rebuild it. Some believed the collapse carried a message from the gods. Others may simply have understood how difficult it would be to raise such a structure again. Whatever the reason, the statue remains where it had fallen, becoming a different kind of landmark. Travelers came not to see the Colossus standing, but to see where it had once stood. In this way, the monument continued to shape memory, even after it had lost its form. Centuries later, when new rulers arrived on the island from distant regions to the east, the bronze fragments were eventually removed and carried away. According to later accounts, the metal was loaded onto hundreds of animals and transported elsewhere, where it was melted down and reused for purposes no longer connected to the island that had first shaped it. The body of Helios disappeared into many smaller objects. Tools, ornaments, and weapons may have carried pieces of that bronze into places far beyond Rhodes itself. Although the statue no longer stands beside the harbor, its material presence continues to move quietly through the world in new forms. The Colossus had fallen, but it had not ceased. It remains in descriptions written by travelers who had seen its fragments. It remains in stories repeated by sailors, crossing the same waters where it once reflected the sun. And it remains in the imagination of later generations who continued to picture a bronze guardian watching over the sea. Among the wonders of the ancient world, it was one of the shortest lived, yet it leaves behind one of the longest memories. And while the Colossus rested beside its harbor for centuries after its fall, another monument beside a different shoreline would continue to stand upright far longer, carrying light across dark water night after night until even its brilliance slowly faded beneath the patience of the earth itself. Along the northern coast of Egypt, where the Mediterranean Sea stretches wide and open beneath a sky that changes color slowly with the passing hours, there once stood a tower whose purpose was different from all the other wonders of the ancient world. It was not built to honor a god. It was not built to guard a tomb. It was not built to celebrate victory after war. It was built to help strangers find their way home. The lighthouse of Alexandria rose from the small island of Pharos just beyond the entrance to one of the busiest harbors of the ancient Mediterranean. Ships arrived from distant shores, approaching the city after days or weeks at sea, guided only by stars at night and shifting coastlines during the day. A single mistake near the harbor could damage a vessel or scatter its cargo across hidden rocks beneath the water. The lighthouse changed that uncertainty. It stood as a steady signal between sea and land, offering direction long before the invention of maps as we know them today. Sailors who saw its light knew they were nearing safety. Merchants carrying goods from distant regions could adjust their course with confidence. Travelers returning after long journeys could recognize the approach to Alexandria even in darkness. The tower itself rose in stages. At its base stood a wide square foundation of stone that anchored the structure firmly against wind and waves. Above that rose an 8-sided middle section that narrowed the tower as it climbed higher into the sky. At the very top stood a circular platform where a flame burned through the night, reflected by polished metal surfaces so that its glow could travel across the water for many miles. From a distance, The lighthouse must have appeared like a star resting on the edge of the earth. During the day, sunlight reflected from its pale stone walls. At night, the flame above its summit became a point of orientation for anyone crossing the dark surface of the sea. The tower stands so tall that visitors approaching the harbor could see it long before the city itself appears along the shoreline. It was a practical structure, but it was also something more. It represents confidence in human skill. The rulers who ordered its construction believed that architecture could do more than preserve memory. They believed it could protect movement itself. By raising a tower that carries light across the water, they transformed the coastline into a place of welcome rather than uncertainty. For centuries, the lighthouse fulfilled this purpose. It remains standing through the rise and fall of kingdoms that changed the identity of Alexandria many times. Greek rulers governed the city. Later, Roman administrators reshaped its institutions. Still later, new cultures brought different languages and traditions to its streets. Yet the lighthouse continued to burn above the harbor, unchanged in its quiet responsibility. Generations of sailors trust its presence without knowing the names of the people who had built it. This long endurance makes the tower different from the other wonders. While some collapsed within decades and others disappeared through fire or dismantling, the lighthouse of Alexandria remained useful for more than 1,000 years. Its survival seems to suggest that structures built for service might last longer than those built for display. But even usefulness cannot prevent the slow work of the earth. Over many centuries, earthquakes pass through the region again and again. Each movement of the ground weakens the structure slightly more. Cracks broadened, stones shifted, sections of the tower fell away one after another. The flame that had once guided ships across the sea disappeared as the upper levels collapsed. Eventually, the lighthouse itself sank into ruin. Its stones did not vanish entirely. Some were later reused in the construction of a fortress that still stands near the harbor today. Others slipped beneath the water, where they rested quietly for hundreds of years before divers rediscovered them resting on the seafloor in the late 20th century. Even beneath the surface, the outline of the monument remains visible. Massive blocks shaped by ancient hands lay scattered among fish and shifting currents. Fragments of statues once placed near the entrance of the harbor could still be seen resting where they had fallen, their forms softened by time but not erased. In this way, the lighthouse did not disappear. It changed its horizon. Once it guided travelers above the water, now it rests beneath it, still marking the same shoreline in a different way. With its slow decline, the last of the 7 wonders of the ancient world finally joined the others in silence. One by one, they had fallen, burned, shifted recognition, or faded beyond. Only the Great Pyramid remains, standing where it had first been placed, watching centuries pass across the desert with patient stillness. Yet even as the monuments themselves disappeared, something unexpected continued to endure. The stories remained. Travelers continued repeating their names, writers continued describing their shapes, artists continued imagining their forms long after their stones had scattered across fields, cities, and shorelines. The wonders had not survived as structures, they had survived as memory. And as the age of towering monuments slowly gave way to quieter expressions of beauty, shaped not from stone but from gesture, conversation, and atmosphere, another kind of wonder began to emerge in a place far from desert pyramids and Mediterranean harbors, where lantern light flickered softly along narrow streets, and time itself seemed to move more slowly than anywhere else in the world. Long after the last of the ancient wonders had begun to fade into ruin or legend, another kind of wonder quietly took shape far from the deserts of Egypt and the harbors of the Mediterranean. It appears not as a tower or a temple, but as an evening street lit by paper lanterns. In the city once known as Edo, which would later become Tokyo, there were districts where the ordinary rhythm of the day softened as night arrived. Wooden gates marked their entrances. Narrow streets curved gently between rows of houses. Lantern light reflected along polished floors and paper screens. Voices lowered, footsteps slowed. Even the air seemed to change its pace. These places became known as the floating world. The name did not suggest escape from reality. Instead, it describes a space where reality was arranged differently, shaped with intention so that time itself felt lighter. Visitors enter knowing they will not remain forever. That knowledge gave each moment a particular clarity, like the brief glow of sunset before evening settles fully across the sky. Inside the tea houses of these districts, beauty was not displayed in grand gestures. It appeared in small details. A sleeve adjusted with quiet precision, a cup of tea placed slightly closer to a guest who had spoken softly. A line of poetry reminds at exactly the right moment, the faint sound of a shamisen drifting through a corridor where no one seemed to hurry. These gestures were not accidental. They were practiced for years. The women known as geisha were trained not only in music and dance, but in conversation, observation, and timing. Their role was not to impress through spectacle. It was to create atmosphere. A gathering shaped by their presence felt balanced without anyone needing to explain why. Laughter arrived naturally. Silence became comfortable rather than uncertain. Even dissent softened beneath the rhythm of shared attention. In this way, the floating world became something rare. It was a place where emotions moved gently instead of quickly. Underlying this atmosphere was a quiet aesthetic principle often described by a single word that suggested elegance without excess. It values restraint more than display. It preferred suggestion to certainty. Beauty was understood not as something fully revealed, but as something partly hidden, waiting to be noticed rather than announced. Visitors returned again and again, not because they expected permanence, but because they understood its absence. They knew the moment would pass. And that knowledge makes it meaningful. For generations, these districts remained part of the cultural landscape of Edo, Japan. Lantern light continued to mark their streets, musicians continued to tune their instruments, guests continued to step through sliding doors into rooms where conversation unfolded slowly across the evening. Yet beyond these quiet neighborhoods, the wider world was beginning to change. Ships from distant countries arrived along Japan's coasts with unfamiliar technologies and unfamiliar expectations. New roads connected cities that had once felt separate. Factories began to rise where fields had once stretched outward toward the horizon. Electric lights replaced lanterns. Printed newspapers carried news more quickly than traveling storytellers ever could. This period of transformation became known as the Meiji Restoration. It reshaped the country with remarkable speed. Clothing changed, education changed, government changed, even the sense of time itself seemed to move differently as railways shortened distances that had once taken days to cross on foot. Within this new rhythm, the floating world began to shift. Tea houses closed quietly. Musicians found fewer evenings filled with guests who understood the older traditions. Conversations that once unfolded slowly now compete with the faster pace of modern life. The delicate balance between suggestion and silence became more difficult to maintain in a society increasingly shaped by efficiency and visibility. The floating world did not collapse in a single moment. It drifted. Some houses remain open. Some artists continued their work. Certain streets still carry lantern light into the evening. Yet the atmosphere that had once defined the districts grew thinner, like mist lifting slowly from a river at sunrise. What remained was memory. Paintings preserved the gestures, poems preserved the voices, stories preserved the rhythm of evenings when time seemed to pause long enough for people to notice the quiet beauty of shared attention. In this way, the floating world follows a path similar to the ancient wonders that came before it. It did not survive because its buildings remained unchanged. It survived because its atmosphere continued to be remembered. Even streets now, when visitors walk through certain in Kyoto or Tokyo at dusk, they sometimes feel a faint echo of that earlier rhythm. A lantern sways slightly in the evening air. A door slides open and closes again. Footsteps pass along wooden walkways with a sound that has not changed for centuries. For a moment, time seems to move differently, and then the moment passes. Yet in other parts of the world, long before lantern light reflected along those narrow streets, people believed that time itself could be guided through ritual movement. They gathered not in tea houses, but in stone courts open to the sky, where the path of the sun was understood not as something to observe, but as something to protect through action. Long before evening lanterns glowed along the streets of Edo, and long before travelers gathered lists of wonders beside Mediterranean harbors, there were cities rising from the forests of Mesoamerica where people believed the movement of the sun itself depended, in part, on what happened within walls of stone. These cities did not stand beside wide deserts or open seas. They rose instead of thick landscapes with trees, rivers, and birds whose calls carried through the morning air. Pyramids appear above the forest canopy like stepped mountains. Pathways connected plazas where ceremonies unfolded beneath open sky. And within many of these cities there stood long stone corridors, unlike any other structures in the ancient world. These were the ballcourts. At first glance they might appear simple. Two long walls facing one another across a narrow playing space. Steps rose along their sides. Stone surfaces show the marks of carving tools that had shaped them centuries earlier. To someone unfamiliar with their purpose, the courts might seem like places designed only for competition or exercise. Yet the people who built them understood them differently. They believed these spaces formed a meeting point between worlds. When participants enter a ball court, they step into a landscape that represents more than the ground beneath their feet. The high stone walls rising on either side suggested the boundaries of a passageway leading through layers of existence. Above them stretched the open sky. Beneath them lay the unseen depths associated with the underworld. The court stands itself between these realms, linking them together in a single narrow space where movement carries meaning. Even the orientation of the courts reflects this intention. Many were carefully aligned so that sunlight entered at particular angles during important moments of the year. Shadows traveled along the walls in patterns that repeat across generations. The architecture did not simply contain activity, it shaped the way time appears within the space. Sound behaved differently there as well. Visitors standing at one end of certain ball courts discovered that even a quiet voice could travel clearly across the entire length of the corridor. A clap of the hands echoed from wall to wall before fading slowly into silence. When a ball struck the stone surface during play, the sound carried upward and outward as though the court itself were answering the movement. To those who gathered nearby, these echoes were not accidents. They were reminders that the court was listening. Carved along the walls were figures that watched the events unfolding within the narrow passage below them. Some appear as rulers dressed in ceremonial clothing. Others took the form of serpents' bodies curved across the stone in whose flowing lines that suggested motion rather than stillness. These carvings did not decorate the court in the way paintings decorate a room. They formed part of the meaning of the space itself. Each figure reminds participants that they were not alone. They were acting within a story already in progress. When people gathered beside the court, they did not sit as spectators waiting for entertainment. They stood as witnesses to an event that carried consequences beyond the visible world. The movement of players across the stone floor echoed believed to take place in the sky above and in the hidden regions below the earth movements. In this way, the ball court became something rare in human architecture. It was not a place built to preserve memory. It was a place built to maintain balance. The narrowness of the court requires careful control. Players could not move freely in wide arcs the way they might in open fields. Instead, their gestures remained precise and measured. Every movement mattered. Every contact between body and ball carries weight beyond the moment itself. Even the stillness before the game began to have meaning. Participants entered the space wearing protective padding made from layered materials that softened the impact of the heavy rubber ball they will soon set in motion. The air remained quiet. Shadows rested along the walls. Observers gathered slowly along the edges of the court, aware that what they were about to testify belongs to an older tradition than any individual present. In that stillness, the court seemed to wait. It waited not for competition, but for alignment. Because once the ball began to move across the stone floor, it will no longer represent only the skill of the players guiding it. It would represent something much larger, something rising and falling across the sky each day, whether anyone watched it or not. Within this narrow passage between walls of carved stone, a simple object will begin to travel in a pattern that echoes the path of the sun itself. When the players stepped into the narrow stone corridor of the ball court, they did not carry with them a simple object meant only for play. They carried something that moved between worlds. The ball was itself made from natural rubber, gathered from trees that grew in the forests surrounding many Maya cities. The material had a strange and remarkable quality. It could be shaped by hand and would return to its form after being struck. It can move with weight and elasticity at the same time. To those who first discovered how to prepare it, the substance must have almost seemed alive. When formed into a sphere and set in motion across the stone floor of the court, it became something more than a crafted object. It became a reflection. For the people who gathered around the court, the movement of the ball echoed a pattern they watched every day above their heads. At sunrise, a bright circle appears along the horizon and began its steady journey across the sky. At sunset, it disappeared again beneath the earth, leaving darkness behind until morning returned. This daily path was not understood as automatic. It was understood as something that required balance. The ball moving across the court followed a similar journey. It rose, fell, struck the stone walls, and returned again to motion. Each impact created a sharp sound that traveled along the corridor and echoed back toward the players guiding it. These echoes did not feel accidental. They seemed to answer the movement, as though the court itself were repeating the rhythm of the sky. In this way, the game became a quiet conversation between human action and cosmic movement. Observers watching from the sides of the court did not see only skill. They saw alignment. They believed the ball represented the sun as it traveled across the heavens and then passed through the hidden regions beneath the earth before returning again with the next dawn. Its motion across the narrow corridor reminded them of that passage. Each strike against the wall suggested resistance. Each return to the center suggested renewal. Even the weight of the ball contributes to its meaning. Unlike the light objects used in many later games, this ball carries a density that requires careful control. Players guide it with their hips, shoulders, and forearms, moving with precision rather than speed. Every gesture demands attention. Every strike carries intention. The effort required to keep effort, the ball in motion mirrored the believed necessary to maintain the order of the world itself. Nothing about the game was casual. It unfolded within patterns that had been repeated for generations. Participants did not enter the court expecting personal victory alone. They entered knowing they were continuing a tradition that connected their movements to cycles older than memory. The path of the ball across the court was not invented by them. It had been traced many times before and will be traced again long after they left the space behind. This repetition gave the game its quiet authority. The same motions returned again and again, just as sunrise returned each morning and sunset returned each evening. To those watching, this rhythm suggested stability within a world that otherwise changed constantly. Storms passed, rulers changed, forests shifted, yet the path of the sun continued, and the movement of the ball helped remind them why. The echoes traveling between the walls strengthened this impression. When the ball struck the stone surface, the sound moved outward and returned again in softened form. Listeners standing nearby could hear not only the impact itself, but its reflection across the court. It was as though the space answered each motion with its own voice. Some courts were shaped so carefully that even a single sound could travel from one end to the other without losing its clarity. A quiet strike became something larger as it moved through the corridor. The court carried it forward and returned it again, repeating the gesture and sound as the players repeated it in movement. To those gathered there, the game did not feel isolated from the sky above. It felt connected to it. In this way, the ball came to represent more than the visible sun alone. It carries the idea of continuity. Its motion suggests that cycles could be maintained through attention and care. Its return to the center of the court suggests that balance could be restored even after disruption. The players guiding it were not simply directing its path. They were participating in a larger pattern. Over time, stories emerged that explained this connection more clearly. These stories spoke of figures who had once entered a court much like this one and played a game whose outcome shaped the fate of the world itself. Their actions were remembered not only as competition, but as transformation. And within those stories, the players who stepped onto the court each day began to see themselves reflected in something far older than the cities around them. They were not only guiding the sun, they were repeating a journey first taken by heroes who had already traveled through darkness and returned again with light. Long before the first players stepped into the stone courts of the Maya cities, there was already a story waiting for them there. This city was not written on walls alone. It was carried in memory, repeated in quiet voices beside evening fires, and passed carefully from one generation to the next. The story explains why the movement of a ball across a narrow corridor could matter to the rising of the sun, and why those who entered the court did not walk there as ordinary competitors. They walked there as echoes of older travelers. In this story, there were two brothers, often reminded today as the hero twins. They were not kings, and they were not warriors in the usual sense. Instead, they were figures who moved between worlds, carrying curiosity and courage into places where others feared to go. Their journey began with a game. According to the story, the sound of their ball struck the ground, reached the ears of powerful beings who lived beneath the earth in a shadowed realm, sometimes described as the place of tests and trials. These rulers of the unseen world were disturbed by the noise rising from above them. They sent a challenge to the brothers, inviting them to descend and play the game within their own territory. The invitation was not friendly. It was a summons. The brothers accepted. They entered the path leading downward, passing through darkness where ordinary travelers could not easily find their way. Along the route, they encountered obstacles meant to confuse them. False roads appear beside the true one. Voices called from unseen corners. Creatures waited in silence along the edges of the path. Yet the brothers continued forward, guided not only by strength but by attention and patience. When they arrived in the court of the underworld, the rulers who had summoned them prepared a series of trials. Some required endurance, others require cleverness. Still, others demand that the brothers face fear without retreat. Again and again, they were asked to prove whether they understood the rules of the place they had entered. The game itself became part of this testing. The ball moves through the court not only as an object of play, but as a measure of balance between the worlds above and below. Each strike echoed across the stone surfaces of the underworld court, just as it echoed later in the courts of Maya cities on the surface of the earth. At first, the brothers did not succeed. They were overcome by the powers they encountered there. For a time, it seemed their journey had ended in silence beneath the earth. Yet the story did not stop at that moment. Instead, it continued through transformation. The brothers were familiar. They rose again in new form, carrying with them knowledge gained during their passage through darkness. With this understanding, they faced the rulers of the underworld once more. This time, they moved with greater clarity. They understood the patterns hidden within the trials they had been given. They deceive when it appears. They followed the rhythm of the game without losing their place within it. In the end, they prevailed. Their victory was not only their own. It restores balance between the worlds. It allowed light to return where shadow had gathered. It reminded those who told the story that even journeys through darkness could lead back toward renewal. When players entered the ball court generations later, they carried this story with them. They didn't need to speak it aloud. It was already present in the shape of the court, in the movement of the ball, and in the attention of the observers who gathered along the walls. Each motion repeats something the hero twins had done before them. Each strike of the ball echoed the earlier contest played in a place no living person could see. In this way, the game became a bridge between memory and action. Participants were not only continuing a tradition, they were stepping into a path already traced by mythic travelers who had shown how movement across the court could restore harmony to the world itself. The carvings along the walls of many ball courts reflect this connection. Figures appear wearing ceremonial clothing, sometimes holding objects shaped like balls, sometimes standing in poses that suggest transformation rather than stillness. Serpents curve through the scenes, masks appear where might otherwise be expected. These images do not describe a single event, they describe a pattern repeated across generations. The players knew they were part of that pattern. To enter the court was to accept a role within a story larger than any individual life. The outcome of the game mattered not only to those present that day, but to the balance believed to extend across sky, earth, and the unseen regions below. Victory carried meaning, but it did not always carry safety. Because within this ancient story, transformation sometimes requires more than skill alone. It requires a willingness to cross a boundary from which not every participant expected to return in the same form as before. As the sound of the rubber ball faded and the movement within the court slowed, the meaning of the game did not end. For the people who gathered beside those carved stone walls, the match was never only about motion across the court. It was about what followed that motion. It was about the quiet understanding that balance in the world required attention, care, and sometimes an offering that reached beyond ordinary experience. To modern eyes, the idea of sacrifice can appear sudden and difficult to understand. It is often imagined as a moment of loss alone. Yet within the cosmology of many Maya communities, sacrifice carried a different meaning. It suggested continuation. Life, as they understood it, did not move forward in a straight line that ended in disappearance. It moved instead in cycles that returned again and again, like the path of the sun rising each morning after passing through darkness during the night. Within this rhythm, offering something of value became a way of helping the cycle continue. Blood held particular importance within this understanding. It was not seen simply as part of the body. It was understood as something that carried connection between the human world and the sacred forces, believed to shape the movement of time itself. When offerings of blood appear in ritual settings, they were not gestures of destruction. They were gestures of exchange. Something was given so that something else could continue. In some carved reliefs found along the walls of ballcourts, and figures appear standing beside one another in ceremonial dress. From the neck of one figure rises a flowing form that transforms into shapes resembling plants or serpents. These images do not describe a single historical event. They describe transformation. They suggest that life released in one form could return in another, just as seeds placed in the earth return later as green growth beneath the sun. Within this visual language, the end of a game could become the beginning of renewal. Scholars continued to discuss the exact role of sacrifice in different ballgame traditions across the Maya region. Not every match carries the same meaning. Not every court serves the same purpose. Some games were likely played as training, others as ceremony, and still others as part of gatherings that combine many forms of ritual activity. Yet certain scenes carved in stone suggest that in particular moments of great importance, offering one's life after a match could be understood as a profound honor rather than a punishment. To those present, such an offering would not have appeared as an ending. It would have appeared as participation in the continuation of the world. The story of the hero twins helps make this understanding possible. Their journey through the underworld and their return back into light showed that movement through darkness did not lead only to silence. It could lead to transformation. It could lead to renewal. It could restore balance where imbalance had appeared. Players stepping onto the court carry this story with them. They entered the space knowing that the outcome of the match might shape more than their own reputation. But it might shape the relationship between their community and the forces believed to guide the sky above them. Their movements echoed earlier journeys described in sacred stories. Their actions followed patterns repeated across generations. The observers gathered along the edges of the court shared in this understanding. They did not stand apart from the event. Their presence formed part of the ritual itself. Their attention helped maintain the meaning of what unfolded before them. When silence followed the final movement of the ball, that silence carried weight. It marks the completion of a cycle rather than the end of an activity. In this way, the court became a place where human action touched something larger than individual life. Even the carvings left behind on stone walls suggest this connection. Figures appear holding ceremonial objects. Serpents emerge from flowing lines that resemble streams of life continuing beyond the visible moment. Plants rise where movement once ended. Each image reminds the viewer that transformation stands at the center of the ritual. Nothing simply CR. It changed form. Over time, centuries passed. Cities that had once filled the forest with voices and ceremony slowly emptied. Pathways became quiet, stone structures softened beneath vines and rain. Yet the meaning carried within the ballgame did not vanish with those cities. It continued to travel. Fragments of the tradition remained in later communities across the region. In some places, people still played games using rubber balls shaped in ways that echoed earlier forms. In others, stories preserve the memory of courts where movement once shaped the balance of the world. Even where the original ceremonies had changed, the rhythm of repetition remained. The game has entered memory. And there, like the wonders built from stone in distant lands, it found a different way to endure. Long after the final echoes of the ball-striking stone had faded from the courts of the Maya cities, the spaces where those sounds once traveled did not disappear. They remained. Across the forests of Mesoamerica, stone corridors still rise from the earth where players once moved with careful precision beneath open sky. Trees now stand where spectators once gathered, roots wind slowly between carved blocks. Rain collects in shallow depressions along worn steps. Yet the shape of the courts continues to guide the eye in the same way it did centuries ago. They still form narrow passages between worlds. At Chichen Itza, one of the largest surviving ball courts stretches across the landscape with a quiet authority that feels almost unchanged by time. Its long stone walls rise high above the playing space, carrying carvings that show figures dressed in ceremonial clothing, holding objects shaped like balls, standing in poses that suggest movement continuing beyond the visible moment. Serpents appear among these figures, their bodies curving outward as though connecting the ground beneath the court to the sky above it. Visitors who walk through the court today often pause without speaking. Even without the sound of the game itself, the space still carries its rhythm. If a single clap is made near one end of the court, the sound travels clearly across the distance and returns again in softened form. The echo arrives not as noise, but as a reminder that the stone surfaces still respond to movement just as they did when the courts were first shaped. The architecture continues listening. In this way, the courts have not become silent, they have always been patient. The cities that once surrounded them changed slowly over time. Pathways filled with grass, buildings softened beneath rain and heat, populations shift toward new settlements beyond the forests. Yet the courts remain where they had always stood, carrying the outline of ceremonies that once connected earth, sky, and the unseen world beneath them. Even where the original rituals no longer take place in the same form, their memory continues to travel. In some regions of western Mexico today, communities still play games using rubber balls that echo earlier traditions. The movements are not identical to those once performed in the great ceremonial courts, and the meanings attached to them have changed with the passing of centuries. Yet the rhythm of guiding a heavy ball through careful motion remains familiar. The sound of impact still carries across open ground. The sense of repetition still links present movement with earlier generations. The game has been perfect. It has not disappeared. Stories continue to accompany these movements. In certain communities, elders still speak of earlier times when the ball game carried deeper ceremonial meaning. The details differ from place to place. Some emphasize connection with ancestors, and others describe the game as part of seasonal gatherings that mark transitions within the year. In each case, the tradition survives not as a fixed structure, but as a living pattern that shifts gently with the needs of those who continue it. This is how ritual often endures. It changes shape rather than ending completely. The courts themselves help preserve that continuity. Even when their surfaces show cracks and their edges soften beneath vines, their proportions remain invisible. The narrow passage between walls still suggests a pathway rather than an arena. The open sky above still frames movement in the same way it once framed the path of the sun across the day. Standing within these spaces now, it is possible to imagine the earlier gatherings that once filled them with motion. The players move carefully along the stone floor. The observers watched in quiet attention from the edges of the court, the sound of the ball returning again and again against carved surfaces that seemed to answer its movement. Nothing of this remains visible in full, yet none of it has completely disappeared. The memory of the game continues to travel through carvings, stories, and gestures that survive long after the cities themselves change their form. The courts no longer shape the movement of the sun in the way earlier generations believed they did, but they still shape the imagination of those who enter them. They remind visitors that architecture can hold meaning even after its original purpose has passed. They remind us that ritual rarely vanishes all at once. And as the forests continue to grow around these stone corridors, another kind of memory waits beyond them, carried not through carved walls or repeated movements, but through stories that traveled across open plains where no monuments were built to contain them. Far beyond the forests where stone ballcourts still rest among trees, and far beyond the deserts where pyramids continue to rise against the horizon, there stretches a different kind of landscape altogether. It is a land without walls. Across the wide grasslands of Central Asia, the earth opens outward in every direction. The horizon does not end in towers or temples. It fades gradually into distance, where sky and ground meet without interruption. Wind moves freely across the plains, bending tall grasses in long, quiet waves. Herds travel slowly across this open space, guided by riders who know the shape of the land not through maps, but through memory. This was the world of the Massagetæ. They did not build cities in stone. They did not surround themselves with monuments meant to endure for thousands of years. Instead, they carried their homes with them. They're formed around communities' movement rather than permanence. Camps rose and disappeared with the seasons. Paths follow the needs of animals and water rather than the boundaries of walls. In such a world, memories traveled differently. It lived in stories spoken beside fires. It lived in songs carried across open ground by riders moving from one encampment to another. It lived in the careful repetition of names that connected families across generations. Without temples to preserve their history in carved stone, the Massagetæ preserves it in voices and movement. Their strength came not from fortifications, but from distance. To outsiders accustomed to cities, this landscape might seem empty. Yet for those who lived within it, the steppe was not empty at all. It was a place of orientation. Rivers mark pathways across the plains. Hills signaled direction from afar. Stars guided travel during the night as reliably as roads guided movement in settled lands. Children learned early how to ride. Horses were not simply animals of labor or transport. They were companions in movement, extensions of the body that allowed people to travel farther than walls would ever allow them to remain. Riders could cross wide distances quickly, carrying news between groups that might otherwise have remained separated by days of travel on foot. In this way, the steppe itself became a kind of memory. It held roots that did not appear on maps, but remained known through generations of repeated journeys. It held watering places reminded through stories. It held seasonal patterns that shaped communities when gathered and when they moved apart again. Life here requires attention rather than enclosure. This difference shaped the way the Massagetæ understood power. Where empires measured strength through territory fixed on maps, the people of the steppe measured strength through mobility. Where rulers in distant capitals built monuments to declare their permanence, leaders among the Massagetæ guided communities that remained strong precisely because they did not depend on permanence at all. They could move, and movement made them difficult to conquer. To the west of these open plains, another kind of world had taken shape. There, cities rose behind walls. Roads connected distant provinces. Messages traveled along routes between administrative centers. At the heart of this system stood one of the most powerful rulers of the ancient world. His name was Cyrus. He governs an empire that stretches across vast regions, linking mountains, rivers, and coastlines into a single political structure larger than any that had existed before it. Under his rule, territories that once stood apart had been drawn together through alliances, negotiations, and sometimes through force. Yet even an empire that wide did not reach everywhere. Beyond its eastern frontier lay the lands of the Massagetæ. From the perspective of imperial maps, these lands appear uncertain and undefined. They did not contain cities that could be counted or walls that could be measured. They did not offer boundaries that could easily be drawn with ink. Yet they held something just as powerful as any fortified capital. They held independence. When Cyrus turned his attention toward these regions, he did not encounter a kingdom shaped by stone gates or palace courtyards. He encountered a people shaped by movement across open ground, guided by leaders whose authority rested not on monuments, but on trust carried through generations. Among those leaders stood a queen whose name would travel farther than any structure could have carried it. Her story will begin not with battle, but with a message delivered across the wide grasslands where no walls stood to receive it. Across the open plains east of the Persian Empire, where the horizon stretched without walls and the wind carried messages farther than any stone road could reach, there lived a ruler whose authority did not depend on cities, towers, or carved monuments. Her name was Tomyris. She led the Masajte, a people who understood strength not as the ability to remain in one place, but as the ability to move together across a landscape that never stood still. Leadership among them did not rest behind palace gates. It traveled with the community itself, shaped by decisions made in the presence of those who shared its consequences. Tomyris ruled in this way. Her voice carried weight because it belonged to someone who understood the land her people crossed each season, the rivers they followed, and the distances they trusted their horses to carry them. She did not stand above her people like a distant figure carved in stone. She stood among them as a guide whose choices shaped their survival. It was into this world that a message arrived from the west. Messengers traveled across the steppe bearing words from Cyrus, the ruler of a growing empire whose influence had already reached far beyond the mountains and rivers that once defined its borders. His campaigns had joined distant territories together under a single authority. Cities that had once stood apart now answered to his administration. Roads carried news more quickly than before. Alliances connected regions that had never previously shared a political center. Yet, beyond his frontier remains lands that did not follow these patterns. The Masajte lived there. Cyrus did not begin with an army. He began with a proposal. According to accounts preserved by later historians, he offered marriage to Tomyris, presenting the suggestion as a path toward alliance between their peoples. In many parts of the ancient world, such proposals formed a familiar language of diplomacy. They create bonds that link territories without requiring conflict. They allowed rulers to extend influence through kinship rather than force. Yet Tomyris understood that this proposal carried more than courtesy. She recognized the direction from which it came. Empires did not grow by accident. They expanded step by step, often beginning with gestures that appeared peaceful, before becoming something more permanent. A marriage between rulers could reshape the balance of authority as effectively as a campaign across a frontier. Her answer was careful. She did not respond with anger. She did not respond with fear. Instead, she declined the proposal and asked that Cyrus remain within his own lands rather than attempt to extend his reach across the steppe. It was a refusal to speak with clarity rather than hostility. In that moment, she preserved the independence of her people without drawing a weapon. The decision reveals something important about the difference between the world Cyrus governed and the world Tomyris protected. In cities surrounded by walls, alliances often formed through structures designed to last. Boundaries could be marked in stone, agreements could be written and stored, authority could be measured through the number of territories connected by roads. On the steppe, authority moved differently. It depends on trust carried across distance. It depends on cooperation among riders who could not rely on fortifications to protect them. It depends on the ability to recognize when an invitation might quietly reshape the freedom of those who accept it. Tomyris recognized that moment clearly. Her refusal did not end the encounter between her people and the empire to the west. Instead, it changed its direction. Cyrus continued to consider the lands beyond his frontier. The Masajte continued to move across the plains they knew so well. Between them lay a distance shaped not only by geography, but by two different understandings of what power meant. For a time, that distance held. Messengers carry words rather than weapons. Riders cross the grasslands without meeting armies along their path. The horizon remains open and quiet, beneath the same sky both peoples share. Yet the balance between them did not remain unchanged. Within the story that followed, a moment will arrive when diplomacy gave way to strategy, and strategy gave way to loss. The path between empire and steppe will narrow until movement could no longer avoid confrontation. And when that moment comes, it will not be a lone territory that shapes the outcome. It would be memory, grief, and the determination of a leader who understood that some boundaries could not be crossed without consequence. After Queen Tomyris declined the proposal that might have joined her people to the expanding world of the Persian Empire, the distance between steppe and empire did not remain unchanged for long. Cyrus continued to look eastward. The lands beyond his frontier still lay outside his authority, and their independence stands in contrast to the territories already gathered under his rule. Where roads ended and maps became uncertain, the open plains of the Massagetæ remained beyond his reach. It was there that he turned his attention next, not with another proposal, but with a different kind of plan. According to accounts reminded by later historians, Cyrus arranged a strategy that relied less on direct confrontation and more on surprise. He established a camp along the frontier and left behind supplies unfamiliar to the Massagetæ. Among them were foods and drinks that differed from what steppe communities usually prepare for themselves. When a group of Massagetæ warriors entered the abandoned camp, they found these provisions waiting. They paused there. What followed changed the direction of the encounter between the two peoples. Among those who entered the camp was the son of Tomyris, a leader trusted within his community and respected among the riders who moved across the plains with him. The gathering that followed seemed at first like an unexpected opportunity rather than a danger. Yet it became something else. Persian forces invaded. The warriors who had remained behind were taken captive. Among them was Tomyris' son. News traveled quickly across the steppe. Messengers carried word of what had happened back to Tomyris. The open land that had once separated her people from the empire now carries a different message across its distance. It was no longer a frontier marked by caution alone. It has become a place where trust has been tested. With later accounts describe how her son died after his capture, choosing not to live in captivity. When this news reached Tomyris, her response did not arrive in silence. She sent a message to Cyrus. In it, she warned him to return what he had taken and to withdraw from the lands beyond his frontier. The message carries both grief and clarity. It did not ask for negotiation, it asked for restoration. The warning was not accepted. Instead, both sides began preparing for a confrontation that would decide the outcome of their encounter. Across the plains, riders gathered. The Massagetæ did not form armies in the same way as the empire to the west. They moved in coordinated groups shaped by familiarity with the land rather than by fixed formations. Horses carried them across distances quickly. Knowledge of rivers and open ground allows them to approach and withdraw with flexibility that settled armies often find difficult to match. The battle that followed took place far from cities and walls. There were no towers watching from above. There were no gates to defend. Only open ground stretched beneath the sky as the two forces met. Later, writers described the conflict as one of the most difficult the Persian army had faced. The Massagetæ fights with determination, shaped not only by strategy, but by memory. The loss of Tomyris' son had changed the meaning of the encounter. It was no longer only a question of territory, it had become a question of justice. The struggle continued across the plain until the balance shifted. Cyrus fell during the fighting. His death marked the end of a campaign that had carried him across vast regions of the ancient world. The empire he had built would continue beyond him, guided by those who followed his rule. Yet the encounter with the Massagetæ remains one of the final moments remembered in connection with his life. Accounts preserved by Herodotus describe what happened afterward. Tomyris, having learned of Cyrus's death, is said to have searched for his body among those who had fallen in the battle. When she found him, she placed his head into a vessel filled with blood and spoke words that reflected both grief and judgment. She told him to drink the battle he had sought. Whether every detail of this moment unfolded exactly as later writers described cannot be known with certainty. Yet, the story remained. See, it traveled across generations not because it recorded the movement of armies alone, but because it carried a meaning that listeners continued to recognize. It speaks of a boundary defense. It spoke of a warning answered. It speaks of a leader who responded to loss with determination rather than silence. Tomyris did not build a monument to mark her victory. She did not raise a tower above the plains. She did not carve her name into stone. Instead, her story moved across the same open ground her people had always crossed, carried by memory rather than architecture. And in this way, it traveled farther than walls could ever have carried it. Across deserts, forests, harbors, and open plains, the traces of the ancient world remain scattered in ways that are not always easy to see at first glance. Some still rise from the ground in silence, others rest beneath the water, others only in the careful movement of hands, in the memory of a surviving melody, or in the repetition of a story spoken beside a fire, long after the place where it first began has changed beyond recognition. When the travelers of the ancient Mediterranean first wrote their list of wonders, they believed they were describing structures that would represent the greatest achievements of human skill. They named towers, temples, statues, and gardens that seemed large enough to stand against time itself. Yet, as the centuries passed, those structures followed different paths. One remains standing in the desert beside the Nile. The others slowly changed their form. The shining temple at Ephesus became scattered stone. The bronze guardian of roads returned to fragments carried across distant roads. The great lighthouse beside Alexandria sank beneath the edge of the sea it once illuminated. The statue of Zeus disappeared in fire far from the valley where it had first been placed. And the gardens, said to rise above Babylon, may never have stood where travelers believed they had seen them. Yet none of these wonders truly disappeared. They continued to travel through memory. Their shapes remain in the imagination of those who repeat their names. Their stories passed from one generation to another across languages that did not exist when the monuments themselves were first built. Even now, when people speak of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, they are repeating a conversation that began more than 2,000 years ago. The structures changed, and the memory did not. In another part of the world, far from stone pyramids and Mediterranean harbors, lantern light once moved gently along narrow streets where conversation unfolded slowly beneath paper screens. The floating world of Edo did not leave behind towers or walls meant to endure across centuries. Its beauty lived instead in gestures too small to preserve in stone. A sleeve adjusted at the right moment, a line of poetry reminds without hesitation. The quiet sound of music passing through a wooden corridor as evening settled over the city. When the pace of the world changed and those streets began to fade into a different rhythm, the floating world did not vanish completely. It remains in paintings and stories and in the careful attention people still give to moments that pass too quickly to be held. And its architecture was atmosphere, and atmosphere can travel farther than buildings. Still earlier, within the forests of Mesoamerica, players once stepped into narrow stone courts where the movement of a rubber ball echoed the path of the sun across the sky. They believed their actions helped maintain the balance that allowed daylight to return each morning. The courts where they gathered still stand among trees that grew slowly around them after the cities changed their form. The game itself adapted. Pots are harmful over time. Even where the original ceremonies no longer unfold in the same way, the rhythm of the ball's movement continues to appear in later traditions shaped by the same landscape. Ritual changed its language, it did not disappear. And beyond both monuments and rituals, across open plains where no towers were raised to mark victory, the story of a queen continues to move through memory long after the empire she faced had changed its borders and its rulers. Tomyris left behind no temple. She left behind no statue. She did not carve her name into stone, yet her story crosses distances that architecture could never have carried. It traveled through the writings of historians. It passed through the voices of communities who remembered the defense of their independence. It survived because it answered a question that people in many places continued to ask: what remains when power disappears? Her answer was simple: memory remains. Across all these places and centuries, a quiet pattern begins to appear. People build monuments because they hope something of themselves will endure. They create rituals because they believe movement can maintain balance. They shape performances because they understand that beauty lives in the present moment. And when none of these remain, they tell stories. Stories become the last architecture. They require no stone, no bronze, no carved inscription. They travel voices wherever travel. They cross rivers, forests, deserts, and plains without needing walls to protect them. They change shape without losing their meaning. They survive because they belong to everyone who remembers them. Perhaps this is why the ancient wonders continue to feel familiar even now. Not because they still stand where they were built, but because they still stand within imagination. And perhaps the greatest wonder of all is not what humanity raised from the earth with its hands, but what it carried forward through time with its memory, long after the stones themselves had grown quietly. And so, we've reached the end of tonight's wandering. Whether your eyes are still open or already drifting, thank you for keeping me company here among worn stones, warm embers, and the small, brave rituals of ordinary people. If this brought you a little quiet, you're welcome to subscribe or share it with someone who might need a softer night. For now, rest well. You're safe, you're warm, and the past can keep watching.